May is, as you know, the month where we focus very much on civic space, of course we had World Press Freedom Day as well, and the protection of media workers and journalists is of course of great concern to my office. My office is now present in more places than ever. We have gone from just 2 field offices when we started to 94 presences around the world today. And I would like to see this expanded further. There should, in fact, be a human rights office everywhere, in all states, because there's not one state that isn't immune from actually addressing human rights issues. Everyone can do better. And I have been advocating precisely for this, both in my meetings with member states and in my missions. I've also been speaking about how underfunded and under-resourced my office remains. In fact, I hope we could double our budget. And I call on donors, states, corporate and private, to help us make this happen. A strong UN Human Rights Office and a healthy, well-resourced human rights ecosystem are of global interest, especially at a time when we see the rise in conflicts around the world. Our work and the human rights mechanisms that we support have helped advance the human rights cause. They have helped identify obstacles to development. They have helped identify drivers of conflict and violence. But they also offer solutions and pathways to remedy and for accountability. We work with state institutions, national human rights bodies, and civil society on the ground to help reform laws, to train officials. We also help civil society organizations, human rights defenders and victims, and journalists to do their work wherever we can, rule out violations and set off alarm bells when attacks on, neglect of, or disdain for human rights could set off crises. Our work on accountability and transitional justice has helped ensure that perpetrators of serious human rights violations. Nowhere is the devastating impact of human rights violations more stark than in the midst of armed conflict and in the aftermath of natural disasters. And I would like to refer in particular to Cyclone Mocha, which cut a swathe of destruction throughout, in particular, the western parts of Myanmar. And it is the latest, deeply painful manifestation of a man-made disaster, and I emphasize man-made disaster, resulting from a climate event. For decades, the authorities in Myanmar have deprived, as you know so well, the Rohingya of their rights and freedoms. They have relentlessly attacked other ethnic groups, eroding their capacity to survive in the face of adversity. Displaced communities have subsisted, for example, in temporary bamboo structures, some since 2012, with Myanmar's military repeatedly denying requests of humanitarian agencies to build more sustainable living conditions in areas that are less prone to flooding. And I saw that myself in my several visits to Myanmar, especially to the west and to Rakhine State. They've also consistently prevented the Rohingya from moving freely, including in the days before the cyclone. The damage and loss of life was both foreseeable and avoidable, and is clearly linked with a systematic denial of human rights. It is imperative that the military lift the blockages on travel, allow for needs assessments to take place, and ensure humanitarian access so that life-saving aid and services can be provided. Another situation, the desperate situation of the people of Sudan. Let's not forget how they fought courageously against repression of their rights. It's heartbreaking what is happening in Sudan. Efforts to bring this conflict to an end must have human rights and accountability at their core for any peace to be sustained. Elsewhere, I'm deeply troubled by the growing phenomenon of anti-rights movements that have been active against migrants and refugees, against women, against people belonging to certain faiths, religious and social and racial groups, as well as against LGBTIQ people, among others. And we really need to push back on such anti-rights movements that are fed and stoked by peddlers of lies and disinformation, including by so-called political and religious leaders and influencers. We know that these are people who use populism and repression and even vilification of segments of society to the detriment of society as a whole as a shortcut to power and influence. Such hateful, discredited narratives, we are seeing a further worsening of laws criminalizing lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, including in Uganda. These laws violate a host of human rights. They lead to violence, and they drive people against one another. They leave people behind and undermine development. Many of these laws are actually colonial relics that have imported 200-year-old stigma and discrimination in the 21st century. Hate speech and harmful narratives against migrants and refugees also continue to proliferate. They are accompanied, worryingly, by laws and policies that are anti-migrant, and they risk undermining the basic foundations of international human rights law and international refugee law. Developments that are unfolding in various countries, including the United Kingdom, the US, Italy, Greece, and Lebanon, are particularly concerning, as some of them appear designed to hinder people's ability to seek asylum and other forms of protection, to penalize those who seek to help them, or to return them in unlawful, undignified, and unsustainable ways. Recent violence in Manipur, Northeast India, revealed the underlying tensions between different ethnic and indigenous groups. I urge the authorities to respond to the situation quickly, including by investigating and addressing root causes of the violence in line with their international human rights obligations. Tomorrow, it will be 3 years to the day that George Floyd was murdered by police officers in the US. The small measure of justice achieved in this case remains exceptional in the US and globally. I remain deeply concerned by regular reports of deaths and injuries of people of African descent during or after interactions with law enforcement in a number of countries. There needs to be firm and prompt action by authorities to ensure justice in each case. It is clear that we won't solve the problem of police brutality against people of African descent until we deal with the broader manifestations of systemic racism that permeate every aspect of their lives. The racial abuse faced, once again, by Real Madrid football player Vinicius Jr. in Spain just this past Sunday is a stark reminder of the prevalence of racism in sport. I call on those who organize sporting events to have strategies in place to prevent and counter racism. Much more, indeed, needs to be done to eradicate racial discrimination, and it needs to start with listening to people of African descent, meaningfully involving them and taking genuine steps to act upon their concerns. I also continue to be concerned about the shrinking of civic space, including in China, where there has been a spate of sentences against human rights defenders based on laws that are at variance with international human rights law. Also deeply worrying are crackdowns on women's rights, and these crackdowns remain a tool for men in power to exercise dominance over and enfeeble entire societies. Misogyny is a disease. In combination with violence, it's cancerous. In Afghanistan, the Taliban continue aggressively to seek to erase half of the population from everyday life. Such a system of gender apartheid ruins the development potential of the country as a whole. I will never understand how anyone can trample so cruelly upon the spirit of girls and women. Women and girls face increasingly stringent legal, social, and economic measures in the authorities' enforcement of discriminatory compulsory veiling laws. I urge the government to heed the call of Iranians for reform and to begin by repealing regulations that criminalize non-compliance with mandatory dress codes. The onus is on the state to introduce laws and policies to protect the human rights of women and girls, including their right to participate in public life without fear of retribution or discrimination. Beyond individual country situations, of broader concern for me are recent rapid advances in the development of artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI. Of course, the opportunities are immense, but so are the risks. Human rights need to be baked into AI throughout its entire life cycle, and both governments and companies need to do more to ensure that guardrails are in place. Allow me to end with an appeal to all of you to help push back against the disinformation and manipulation that feeds anti-rights movements and to help protect the space for people to defend their rights. Human rights are universal. The dignity and worth of every human being should not be, cannot be, a questionable, sensitive concept.